A silver spoon hides a deadly secret. Can it be uncovered? Welcome to Faded Echoes. I'm your host, Umbra. Share where you're watching from in the comments. I can't wait to hear from you all. Let's begin. I was halfway through a sandwich at my desk, pastrami with just enough mustard to keep the day interesting, when Fritz buzzed me from the kitchen. His voice had the tone he reserves for those who come to the door looking respectable enough to belong on Park Avenue, but with a twitch that makes him suspect trouble. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "there is a lady. She insists." That "insists" told me everything I needed to know. Wolfe doesn't open his doors to insistence. You want his help? You do it by appointment, letter, or by having a crisis so large it makes the front page of the Times. Still, Fritz wouldn't use that word unless the lady in question had parked herself in our vestibule with the kind of dignity that makes a butler hesitate to toss her out. I set my sandwich aside and went to look. She was tall, mid-30s, dressed in grey that was too plain for fashion but too perfectly cut to be anything but expensive. She had a silver cigarette case in one hand, a small velvet box in the other, and the look of someone who'd rehearsed her entrance in a mirror but hadn't accounted for the fatigue underneath her eyes. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, cool but clipped, "I must speak with Mr. Wolfe, at once." I gave her my standard line. Mr. Wolfe doesn't do at once. He does if it pleases him. And sometimes he doesn't even do that. She opened the velvet box. Inside was a spoon, small, delicate, gleaming silver. The handle carried a crest I didn't recognize, but the thing had the kind of quiet weight that whispered old money and old secrets. "It concerns this," she said, "and what was taken from me with it. Now, I've seen people drag in pistols, poison bottles, even the occasional blood-stained glove, but I'll confess a silver spoon was new. It wasn't the sort of exhibit that screams scandal. Still, the way her fingers gripped that box told me it was no trinket. I left her standing there and went back to Wolfe's office. He was in his chair, naturally, sipping beer and scowling at a dictionary he had opened on his lap. "There's a lady," he told him. "Persistent type. Brought a silver spoon to show and tell." Wolfe didn't look up. "I'm not a pawnbroker." "No, but she claims something was taken from her with it." That got him. The brows lifted, and he shut the dictionary with a clap that would have startled anyone but me. "Bring her," he said. And just like that, the brownstone had a visitor who carried more than a spoon in her velvet box. I went back to the front room and gave the lady a nod that said she had made the cut. She followed me into the office with that measured stride women use when they know every eye in the room is on them, even if the room only has one occupant. Wolfe looked her over without rising, of course, but with the full weight of his disapproval at being interrupted during a perfectly good session of beer and dictionary. "Your name, madam?" he asked, in that tone that can peel varnish from furniture. She placed the velvet box on his desk as if she were presenting tribute to a monarch. "Mrs. Camilla Hazen." I didn't miss the way she said it, like she expected him to know the name, and maybe he did. I didn't. Hazen had the ring of money about it, but then again, half the society page is filled with names that sound like they were born with a crest stamped on them. "What has been taken from you, Mrs. Hazen?" Wolfe asked, peering at the spoon as if it were an insect that had scuttled onto his desk uninvited. She drew in a breath. "The spoon itself is not the loss. It is part of a set. A very old, very private set of silverware that has been in my family for generations. Each piece was engraved, each piece accounted for. Until last week." "And?" Wolfe's eyes had narrowed. He did not enjoy being given morsels instead of meals. "Along with this spoon," she continued, "was a note. That note is gone. It was locked in a drawer in my home inside the case with the silver. When I went to retrieve it yesterday morning, the case had been opened. The spoon left behind, but the note taken. I asked the obvious. "What kind of note are we talking about?" Her fingers tightened around the cigarette case. though she didn't open it. A letter, written many years ago, by someone whose name cannot be made public without ruin. The letter contained a confession of, well, let us say indiscretion. To possess it is to hold power over my family. To lose it is to court disaster. That was vague enough to make Wolfe shift in his chair, which was as close as he ever got to leaning forward. You came here rather than the police. Why? Because the police are blunt instruments, she said. They break what they touch. I need someone who understands discretion. Someone who can deduce without disturbing. I was told Mr. Wolfe is that man. Foy, Wolfe said, but it lacked heat. He flicked a glance at me. Archie. That was my cue. I pulled a notebook from my pocket, already knowing I'd be the one legging it around town while Wolfe stayed rooted here, cultivating orchids and indigestion. Mrs. Hazen, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to the slow cadence he used when making a decision. The value of a silver spoon is trivial. The value of a letter is proportionate to its contents, which you decline to disclose. You ask me to retrieve what you will not describe. That is an absurdity. She met his stare. I'll give her credit. She didn't flinch. I cannot show you the letter because it is gone. I can only tell you this. It named a man, a powerful man, and described actions he would deny to his grave. He is dead now, but others still live, who would kill to keep that name buried. That did it. Wolfe dislikes melodrama, but he respects leverage, and the lady was dangling enough of it to make him curious. You are certain, he asked, that the theft was not the work of a servant, a thief seeking trinkets? She shook her head. The drawer was not forced. The lock was picked. Whoever entered my house knew precisely what they wanted. Nothing else was touched. I asked, who else knew about this letter? For the first time, her composure cracked. She glanced at me, then at Wolfe. Only 3 people. Myself, my late husband, and one other who should not have known at all. Names, Wolfe said. She hesitated, but Wolfe had already closed his eyes, as if her silence bored him beyond endurance. If you intend to withhold, madam, then you may carry your spoon elsewhere. I do not trifle with shadows. All right, she said quickly, almost sharply. The other was my brother-in-law, Philip Hazen. He discovered it, how I do not know, but he confronted my husband with it years ago. There was a quarrel. A settlement was reached. Since then, the letter has been under lock. I could see where this was heading. A family relic, a family secret, a family feud. If I had a nickel for every time one of those trios crossed Wolfe's threshold, I'd own the brownstone by now. Wolfe opened his eyes again. And what, precisely, do you wish me to do? Find the letter, she said simply, quietly, and discover who has it now, before it is used. He drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair, a sign that the engines upstairs were warming. Then he said, Archie, arrange for Mrs. Hazen to deliver to you a list of those with access to her home, servants and kin alike. Secure copies of any correspondence that may illuminate this quarrel she mentions. And he gave the spoon one more withering glance. Bring me the case itself. Its lock may tell me what men cannot. I looked at him. You're really taking this one? I'm not taking anything, he said with a sniff. I'm examining. If the matter proves vaporous, it will end. If not. His eyes fixed on Mrs. Hazen again. You must understand, madam, I do not chase phantoms. I seize them by the throat and wring them dry. If you cannot endure that, leave now. Her chin lifted. I can endure it. That settled it. Wolfe rang for beer, which in his language meant the discussion was concluded. Fritz arrived, gave Mrs. Hazen a look that blended pity with polite curiosity, and retreated with the spoon box tucked under his arm for safekeeping. I walked her out to the vestibule. She paused before leaving, as if the weight of what she'd just set in motion had only now caught up with her. Mr. Goodwin, she said, her voice lower. "I know how strange this sounds, but believe me, the note is dangerous. If it appears, it will destroy more than my family's name." I told her I'd heard stranger things and watched her disappear into the street with that deliberate gait. When I came back inside, Wolfe was already leaning back, eyes closed, lips pursed as if savoring the taste of some mental morsel. "Archie," he murmured. "A spoon, a note, and a quarrel. Pfui. See to the list, and do not dawdle." That was how it began. The brownstone disturbed not by a murder weapon or a bleeding client, but by a missing letter and a silver spoon that shone too brightly for comfort. And if you think that sounds mild, you haven't seen what Nero Wolfe can wring out of mild beginnings. The next morning found me in a cab heading uptown, armed with Wolfe's instructions and my natural suspicion that this job would grow bigger than it looked. Mrs. Hazen had phoned late the previous evening, efficient as a woman who'd spent her life making people jump on her schedule, and arranged for me to visit the Hazen residence at 10 sharp. She had also promised me the list Wolfe wanted: servants, kin, and any other names she was willing to cough up without choking on them. The Hazen place turned out to be exactly what you'd expect from old New York money. 4 stories of brownstone with windows that had stared down a century of change without blinking. The front steps were scrubbed so clean you could have eaten breakfast off them, though I wouldn't recommend pastrami mustard on marble. The door opened before I touched the bell. A man in a dark suit stood there, lean, with eyes like steel ball bearings. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked. His voice had the clipped precision of someone trained to measure words before releasing them. "That's me," I said. "You're Riggs' butler." He stepped aside to let me in. It was a hall of polished wood, a chandelier overhead, and a smell of wax and lilies that tried too hard to be welcoming. Riggs motioned me toward a drawing room where Mrs. Hazen waited in another tailored grey ensemble that looked as though it had been ironed onto her. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, "thank you for coming. I've taken the liberty of gathering those you should meet." That statement pried open a door in my head labeled trouble. You don't get suspects lined up like parade floats unless someone is already rehearsing for a family scandal. Seated near the window was a man who didn't bother to stand. Mid-40s, a shade heavier than comfort, but carrying it with the arrogance of one who never heard the word no. His hair was black, his suit navy, his expression sour. Mrs. Hazen introduced him as Philip Hazen, the brother-in-law, and I filed away the fact that his eyes had the restless dart of someone accustomed to bluffing. Across from him sat a woman in her 20s, slim, blonde, with the kind of poise you usually find at a finishing school. Her eyes, though, told a different story. Sharp, assessing, not nearly as innocent as the packaging. "My niece Daphne," Mrs. Hazen said. Next came a man, in his 30s, ruddy-faced, with the bulk of someone who had spent his youth rowing or playing football and never lost the habit of standing as though waiting for applause. "Edward, my husband's cousin," she added. And finally, leaning against the fireplace with calculated carelessness, was a fellow with wire-rimmed glasses and a tie knotted just loose enough to suggest rebellion. "Victor Lane," she said, "a family friend." 4 suspects, each distinct enough to deserve a footnote, each watching me with varying degrees of interest, suspicion, or boredom. Wolfe would have approved. A circle was forming, neat as chalk on pavement. I pulled out my notebook. "Mrs. Hazen, if you don't mind, I'll start with the basics. When was the last time you saw the letter?" Her hands clasped tightly. 4 days ago, I checked the case myself in the study. The spoon was in its slot, the note beneath it. Everything in order. Yesterday morning, when I returned to the case, the note was gone. Anyone else have access to the study? Riggs has keys, of course. Philip occasionally used the room. Daphne comes and goes. Edward less so. Victor... Her tone cooled. Victor was a guest last week. He stayed 2 nights. All 4 sets of eyes shifted uneasily. If silence could sweat, the room would have been dripping. I turned to Philip. You knew about the letter. His mouth twisted. My late brother told me once. In anger. That was years ago. I've had no interest in it since. Funny, I said, since your sister-in-law seems to think you had more than interest. His glare could have cracked plaster, but he said nothing. Daphne spoke up, her voice smooth. Really, Mr. Goodwin, must we parade old grievances? If a letter is missing, surely it could be a servant. Riggs, perhaps. Riggs didn't so much as blink. I have served this family faithfully for 22 years, miss. If you imply theft, I shall expect a formal apology. Edward shifted in his chair. Enough of this. What's done is done. The thing will turn up. Why dig through closets when the family name is at stake? That remark was practically embroidered with guilt. I noted it. Victor Lane finally spoke, a lazy drawl. If you ask me, this whole business is antique melodrama. A letter, a spoon? We're not in a novel, Mr. Goodwin. I smiled at him. Don't let the title fool you. It's the little props that steal the show. That earned me a look from Daphne that suggested she wasn't used to men answering back. Mrs. Hazen handed me an envelope. Inside was the promised list, servants, relatives, schedules. Wolfe would purr over it the way most men savor cigars. I closed my notebook. Thank you all. I'll be reporting to Mr. Wolfe. If any of you feel compelled to unburden yourselves. My office line is listed in the book. Don't expect sympathy, but you might earn strategy. As Riggs escorted me out, I caught the unmistakable sound of Philip muttering something about outsiders meddling. That was promising. Nothing oils Wolfe's gears like family hostility mixed with secrets. Back in the cab, I thought about the quartet. Each had motive enough if you stretched the fabric. Philip, the quarrel. Daphne, the anxiety over appearances. Edward, the hush-hush defender of the family crest. Victor, the so-called friend whose ease was a mask. One of them had the note, and Wolfe would peel away the masks one by one. When I walked into the brownstone an hour later, Wolfe was already in his chair with a bottle of beer on the desk and orchids upstairs waiting for his attention. I laid the envelope before him and summarized my morning visit. 4 of them, I said. Each as charming as an uninvited guest at a wedding, and every one of them could have had reason to lift that note. He nodded, eyes half closed. Bring me the case tomorrow, Archie. Tonight, attend to the list. Examine their histories. The hand that took the letter is the hand that feared it most. We shall see whose pulse quickens under scrutiny. I knew what that meant. A round of phone calls, library checks, and favors are owed to people who could dig up skeletons faster than a dog in Central Park. Wolfe, meanwhile, would sit and think, the way a cat sits before pouncing. And if I've learned one thing in this line of work, it's that when Wolfe begins to think, someone else's comfortable lie is about to come apart at the seams. I spent the better part of that afternoon working through Wolfe's beloved list, the one Mrs. Hazen had provided in her neat hand. It included every servant in the Hazen household, their years of service, their duties, and the hours they claimed to keep. There were 5 of them. Riggs the butler, who had already given me the impression of a man who'd rather starve than mislay a teaspoon. A housemaid named Lila, a cook named Mrs. Troon, a chauffeur, Carter, and a younger footman, Oliver, who hadn't been with the family long. Then came the relatives already met, plus 2 names circled by Mrs. Hazen herself, friends of her late husband who had known about the quarrel years ago, though she insisted they'd had no reason to pry. Wolfe had underlined those 2 names with a grunt, and then tossed the envelope toward me as if it were a laundry bill. I knew the routine. The groundwork was mine, the orchids were his, and the eventual trap would be all his pleasure. So I did what Archie Goodwin always does. I started calling around. Lon Cohen at the Gazette owed me for a few tips I'd slipped him, and he paid up with a quick summary of the Hazen name in the papers over the last decade. Most of it was society fluff, charitable dinners, and art auctions. But twice, Philip Hazen had popped up in connection with lawsuits, one over a piece of land upstate, another over some shipping concern he'd invested in, and then lost his shirt. Both times he'd settled out of court, which meant he wasn't afraid of throwing money at a problem if it kept him out of headlines. Interesting, but not a smoking gun. Next, I worked the phones with a few old contacts in the legal crowd. Edward, the cousin, had a history of gambling debts, small enough to get hushed, large enough to need explaining. The debts had been covered more than once by the family coffers, and one lawyer hinted that Edward had been warned by his uncle, Camilla's late husband, that another scandal would cut him off permanently. That sounded like motive to me, but then I've learned that in the right light, everyone has motive. As for Daphne, nothing jumped out on the paper. She had attended a fancy boarding school, spent a year in Switzerland, and was now involved in some sort of art collective downtown. The only hint of trouble was a reference to a companion who had made waves at a gallery opening. No name attached, but gossip tends to stain easily. Victor Lane was trickier. He wasn't family, but he'd been orbiting the Hazens long enough to earn himself an invitation to stay under their roof. A journalist I knew said Lane had a reputation as a hanger-on in wealthy circles, too clever by half and always ready with a witty remark that covered his lack of substance. He'd written a few essays, dabbled in publishing, but nothing had stuck. Men like him usually want two things, money and influence, and they usually find clever ways to get both. By the time I finished my calls, it was nearing 7 and Fritz was hinting about dinner in the kitchen. Wolfe was already seated at the dining table, napkin folded across his middle, and I delivered my findings between courses of trout and green beans that deserved more attention than I gave them. When I was done, Wolfe leaned back and steepled his fingers. So, Philip quarrels and pays. Edward gambles and is rescued. Daphne is perhaps indiscreet. Victor drifts like a leaf on water. Each has both cause and opportunity. The letter is the fulcrum, Archie, and whoever wields it seeks leverage. That's fine, I said. But leverage toward what? Philip's land deals are old news. Edward's debts aren't going to raise eyebrows outside the family. Daphne's companion doesn't sound like front-page material, and Victor, well, a man who thrives on gossip might like having a confession in his pocket, but it seems more nuisance than profit. Precisely why, Wolfe said, reaching for his beer, we must regard the letter not only as a weapon, but as a symbol. To steal it is to assert power. To hide it is to prepare a move. The spoon, left behind, is a taunt. The thief declares, I take what matters and discard the rest. I frowned. So this isn't just about keeping secrets buried. It's about someone making sure the others know he or she has the goods. Exactly, he sipped. Tomorrow, Archie, you will return to the Hazen house. Bring me the case and the lock. And while you are there, inquire discreetly about last week. Any unusual visitors, deliveries, disturbances? I distrust coincidences. The theft was timed, not casual. The next morning, Riggs met me at the door with the same granite expression as before. He carried the silver case himself, wrapped in a cloth, as though it were a relic. Mrs. Hazen said you were to have this for Mr. Wolfe's inspection, he said, but she wishes it returned at once. I'll see that it comes back with all the dignity it deserves, I told him. He sniffed, unimpressed, and led me to the study where the theft had occurred. The room was classic rich man territory, leather chairs, walnut shelves groaning with books no one had read, and a desk that looked sturdy enough to stop a truck. Riggs indicated the drawer. The lock was small, old, and looked harmless, but Wolfe would have something to say about it. Anything unusual last week? I asked, casual as I could manage. Riggs hesitated just long enough to register. Unusual? Visitors, calls, deliveries. Anything that doesn't fit the pattern. There was a florist's delivery, he said finally. Not regular, a large arrangement. Came Wednesday afternoon. For whom? He frowned. Miss Daphne accepted it. I recall she said it was from a friend. That struck me as worth noting. What about guests? Only Mr. Lane. He stayed 2 nights, left Thursday morning. And you saw nothing, no one, in the study? His spine stiffened. I do not prowl about the rooms, Mr. Goodwin. I maintain them. That was all I was going to get. I thanked him, pocketed the case, and left before the atmosphere turned any frostier. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe inspected the lock with the care of a man examining a rare orchid's root. He produced a magnifier, turned the mechanism in his hands, and finally grunted. Picked, cleanly, by someone who knew what he sought. This was not an improvisation. I perched on the edge of the desk. So we're dealing with somebody who had skill. That narrows the field, doesn't it? Not enough, he said. Lane is clever. Philip is desperate. Edward is careless but resourceful. Daphne may be reckless in company. Each could have hired a hand. Or, his eyes gleamed, one of them possesses talents unsuspected by the others. I waited, but he said no more. Instead, he closed the case, pushed it aside, and rang for beer. That was Wolfe speak for, I've had enough talk, leave me to ferment. But as I left the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that the florist's delivery wasn't just flowers. Daphne accepting them, the timing of Lane's visit, the precise theft, it was starting to line up into something sharper. Someone had used last week's comings and goings as cover, and whoever held that note now wasn't just planning to sit quietly on it. They were waiting, biding their time until the moment came to strike. And if Wolfe was right, that moment was coming soon. I knew better than to push Wolfe when he slipped into his fermentation mode, so I spent the rest of the evening turning over the florist's delivery in my head. Flowers, on the surface, don't sound like contraband, but in my line of work, they've hidden everything from poison notes to miniature cameras. The timing gnawed at me. Lane staying at the Hazens for 2 nights, a mysterious bouquet arriving, and then, presto, the note vanishes. Even Wolfe, who pretends disdain for anything less than a direct confession, would not shrug at that string of coincidences. The next morning, he summoned me into the office earlier than usual, which meant he had been thinking all night. He sat with the case still on his desk, the lock facing him like a riddle. Archie, he said, you will pay a visit to the florist. Flowers do not appear of their own volition, and florists keep records. Ascertain who sent the arrangement, its contents, and whether it carried anything besides blossoms. That was simple enough. By 9, I was out the door and heading to a shop on Madison Avenue, name supplied by Riggs the day before. The bell over the door jingled, and the air hit me with enough roses and lilies to make me sneeze. Behind the counter was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and sharper memory, if her expression was anything to judge by. I showed her my card. I'm looking for a delivery made last Wednesday to the Hazen residence, large arrangement for Miss Daphne Hazen. She nodded without hesitation. Yes, an order placed over the telephone. White orchids, roses, and lilies. Expensive combination. Paid in cash. Delivered that afternoon. Did the sender leave a name? She pursed her lips. No. Caller said it was to be anonymous. Male voice, I think, though faint. Connection wasn't clear. That was too neat. And the flowers. Did you notice anything unusual about the order? Anything added, tucked in? Her eyebrows rose. Come to think of it, the caller insisted we include a small silver envelope among the blooms. Said it was a card of sorts. We don't usually handle such requests, but he was insistent, and he paid double the charge. Bingo. I kept my voice casual. You wouldn't happen to recall what happened to that envelope, would you? She shook her head. We simply tucked it in. Whether Miss Hazen kept it or discarded it, I couldn't say. I left her with thanks and headed back downtown, chewing on the information. A silver envelope slipped in among the petals. What better disguise for a switch than a delivery meant to draw attention? Daphne accepts the bouquet. The envelope goes missing, and by the next morning, so does the note. Wolfe was going to hum like a hive when he heard this. Back at the brownstone, I laid out the florist's story. Wolfe listened, motionless, then exhaled a slow "Pui." He tapped his fingers on the case. The letter was not stolen from the drawer, Archie. It was exchanged. The bouquet served as subterfuge. Someone placed the envelope in Daphne's hands, and within it, the note. That's one possibility, I said. Another is that the envelope was bait. Maybe it contained nothing, and the real theft still happened at the case. His head turned toward me like an owl spotting prey. Do not be obtuse. A thief skilled enough to pick a lock leaves no need for masquerade. The theft was public, though unrecognized. The florist's envelope was the instrument. I grinned. So our thief made sure Daphne herself carried the note out in the open, without knowing it. Smart. Wolfe's eyes closed. Too smart for Philip Hazen, I suspect. Perhaps too subtle for Edward. Lane, however, or Daphne herself. There lies possibility. Vanity is a dangerous solvent. I sat back. Then the question becomes, who arranged the flowers? Lane was present, Philip had motive, Edward had debts, Daphne had opportunity. Any of them could have picked up a telephone and ordered an anonymous delivery. Wolfe shifted in his chair, which meant the problem was settling into shape. We shall learn which of them did. And soon. Tonight, Archie, summon Mr. Saul Panzer. He will observe. There are too many shifting expressions in that household for me to rely upon your wit alone. I didn't bother to bristle. If Wolfe wanted Saul in the mix, it meant things were heating. Saul was our insurance policy, a man who could shadow a ghost and come back with its hat size. That evening I made the call, and by 9 Saul was in the office, listening as I recounted the florist angle and the household lineup. He nodded once, made a note on a scrap of paper, and said, "I'll watch Lane first. Something about a man who calls himself a family friend but doesn't belong. If he moves, I'll see it." Wolfe approved with a grunt and ordered another beer. I saw the plan forming, though he hadn't said it aloud. Tighten the circle, test each suspect, and wait until one of them cracked under the pressure. The next day I returned to the Hazen house, case in hand, ready with an excuse about Wolfe's examination of the lock. Camilla Hazen received me in the study, alone this time, though the quiet in the house felt staged, as if the others were listening behind walls. I placed the case on the desk. "Mr. Wolfe believes the theft was deliberate," I told her, "and that the flowers delivered last week are tied to it. Do you know who sent them?" Her eyes widened just for a fraction. "Flowers? Why, yes, Daphne received an arrangement. She said it was from a friend. Did you see it?" "A glimpse. White and red, I think." I paid no attention. "And the card?" She shook her head. "I never saw one." That was her story anyway. I wasn't buying the innocence in her voice. Someone in this family had passed that silver envelope hand to hand, and if Wolfe was right, they were all dancing around it like schoolchildren hiding a contraband cigarette. As I left, Daphne appeared at the top of the stairs, watching. She called down lightly, "Did Mr. Wolfe enjoy the spoon?" I looked up at her, keeping my face even. "He savored it. You might say it left a taste worth chewing." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was already waiting, orchids watered, patience at its limit. I delivered the news, including Camilla's selective memory and Daphne's little dig. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and murmured, "The circle tightens. Now we must see who dares the next move. For if the letter has been taken, it has not yet been used. That silence, Archie, is the loudest clue of all." And with that, The brownstone seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the thief to tip their hand. The next 2 days slid by with the deceptive quiet that Wolfe calls the lull before the frog croaks. Saul Panzer phoned in short reports from his tailing of Victor Lane. Lane had a talent for drifting from cafe to bookshop to club, never moving quickly, never alone, but never seeming settled. Saul's take was simple. Lane was restless, nervous, and putting on the kind of show a man does when he wants to look casual while waiting for something. Wolfe listened to each report in silence, eyes closed, lips compressed, as if he were measuring Lane's footsteps against some internal metronome. I wasn't idle. Wolfe had me on the phone again, checking into Daphne's art crowd. That led me to a young painter who described Daphne's friend as a fellow named Marco, a sculptor with more ambition than talent and a gift for expensive tastes. If Daphne had accepted flowers from him, I could imagine the bouquet came with more than petals attached. Wolfe didn't blink when I told him this, but he did mutter, "Vanity again. That girl is not merely reckless. She is susceptible." Pfui. On the third evening, just as Fritz was clearing the dinner table, the brownstone's doorbell rang. I went to the front and found Riggs standing stiff on the stoop, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd rather swallow nails than make a social call. "Mr. Goodwin," he said tightly, "my mistress asks that you and Mr. Wolfe come at once. There has been an intrusion." I brought him inside to the office, where Wolfe raised his head from his chair with a scowl. "What is it?" Riggs hesitated, but there was no stopping now. "The study, sir. The drawer has been disturbed again. Nothing appears taken this time, but the lock was tampered with. Mrs. Hazen is most distressed." That made Wolfe sit forward an inch, which for him was like a man leaping onto a table. "Archie," he said, "we shall not go trotting like hounds. But you will accompany Riggs and inspect. Report at once." So back I went with the butler, who rode the cab as though it were a hearse. At the Hazen house, the family was gathered in the drawing room, each looking like suspects in a tableau staged for Wolfe's eventual pleasure. Camilla sat rigid, Philip scowling, Daphne pale but composed, Edward red-faced with impatience, and Lane leaning back in his chair with a half-smile that asked to be slapped. Riggs led me to the study. Sure enough, the drawer bore marks, faint scratches around the lock, subtle but visible to a man who'd spent years watching Wolfe's demonstrations of intrusion. Someone had tried again, less skillfully this time. Either our thief was growing careless, or someone else was poking around. I straightened and turned to find Daphne in the doorway, arms folded. "Well, Mr. Goodwin, do you intend to catch a thief with a magnifying glass?" "Maybe," I said. "Sometimes a magnifying glass works better than a revolver." She tilted her head, studying me like a puzzle. "My uncle hated secrets, you know. He said they rot people from inside. Perhaps this letter is doing that already." "Maybe, but rot usually leaves a smell. I'll let you know when I catch a whiff." Back in the drawing room, I gave them the verdict. Somebody tried the drawer again, clumsy enough to leave marks. Whoever it was didn't find what they wanted, which suggests they don't know where it is now, which also suggests the letter is still in play. Philip barked, "This is nonsense. We're sitting here accusing shadows while some outsider pokes about our house." "Enough," Edward jumped in. "He's right. We should call the police. End this farce before it disgraces us further." Camilla's eyes flashed. "No, Mr. Wolfe will handle this. The police will not touch it." Lane laughed softly. Remarkable faith in a man who never leaves his chair. I leaned against the doorframe. "That man, Lane, has solved more than you've read about in your literary dabbling, and if I were you, I'd save the smirks. They'll wrinkle." The tension was ripe enough to slice. I left them to stew and returned to Wolfe with the update. He listened, tapping a forefinger on the arm of his chair. "2 attempts," he said finally. "First successful, masked by the bouquet. Second, crude, failed. The same hand? Unlikely." One thief does not shift from finesse to folly. Therefore, Archie, we have more than one party sniffing at the bait." "That figures," I said. Lane acts smug, Philip acts sore, Edward acts like he's hiding behind bluster, and Daphne, well, she's too calm. Somebody already has the letter, and somebody else wants it. Exactly. Which means, Archie, that pressure must be applied. Summon them, tomorrow evening here, in this office. All of them. The spoon, the case, the attempted theft. They have disturbed my house, and I will repay the courtesy. I didn't bother arguing. When Wolfe sets the stage, the curtain always rises. That night, as I was shutting up the office, Wolfe called after me. "Archie." "Yeah. The note, wherever it is, has not yet sung. It will, before long, and when it does, it will not be music. Be ready." And with that, he closed his eyes, as if the world could wait until he decided otherwise. But I knew better. The Hazens were circling, the thief was growing impatient, and tomorrow night, Wolfe would light the match. The next day passed in the peculiar rhythm that always precedes one of Wolfe's office gatherings. Fritz polished the silver as though he expected it to be inspected by royalty. Wolfe stayed glued to his chair in the plant rooms until noon, and then returned downstairs with that settled look he gets when all the threads in his head have finally knotted into a noose, and I spent most of my time on the phone making sure every Hazen and their pet hanger-on was confirmed for the evening performance. Nobody refused, which told me two things. First, curiosity is stronger than fear, and second, not one of them wanted to appear absent when the truth came rolling downhill. By 7 o'clock, the brownstone was as taut as a violin string. The first to arrive was Camilla Hazen, regal as ever in black silk, her chin high enough to clear the Hudson. Philip followed soon after, his scowl practically a second overcoat. Daphne made an entrance with the calculated grace of a woman who knew she was being measured for effect, and Edward lumbered in behind her, flushed from brandy or nerves. Lane arrived last, fashionably late, a smirk plastered on his face as if he had written the evening's script himself. Saul Panzer was present too, not visible but close enough to keep eyes where Wolfe couldn't. Once they were arranged in Wolfe's office, chairs lined against the wall, Wolfe in his throne behind the desk, and me standing ready with my notebook. The silence settled thick. Wolfe let it hang long enough to make them shift in their seats before he began. "You have, all of you, disturbed me," he said, his voice as smooth as if he were lecturing a child on table manners. "That is a feat I do not forgive easily, but the intrusion has provided clarity. A letter was stolen, a spoon abandoned, and a household unsettled. The time has come to name who holds that letter now." Philip snorted. "This is absurd. You cannot possibly—" "Be silent," Wolfe cut him off, so sharply that Philip actually did. "Mr. Goodwin, recount." So I did, in Wolfe's preferred order. The first theft disguised by the florist's delivery, the silver envelope tucked among the orchids, the second attempt clumsy and recent, the household's conflicting accounts, and the evidence that pointed to more than one hand meddling in the business. As I spoke, Wolfe's eyes roved lazily over the group, but I knew better than to think he wasn't watching every twitch and breath. When I finished, Wolfe leaned forward slightly, which for him was dramatic as a pistol shot. "The facts are these. One of you arranged the florist's delivery to extract the note. Another, ignorant of that. Success, attempted later to seize it, and failed. Therefore, two seekers. The question is not whether the letter is dangerous, it is why each of you considered it worth the risk." Camilla's voice was tight. "Mr. Wolfe, you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely that," he said. "Mrs. Hazen, you concealed the letter because it carried shame. Mr. Philip Hazen, you quarreled with your brother over it and feared its contents would diminish you. Mr. Edward, your debts make you vulnerable to disgrace. Miss Daphne, your indiscretions, and perhaps your companion, place you on shaky ground. And Mr. Lane, you hover like a jackal around influence and secrets, eager to feed. Lane smiled faintly. "Colorful metaphors, Mr. Wolfe, but hardly proof." Wolfe ignored him. The florist's envelope was the clever work. It was designed to make Miss Daphne an unwitting courier, ensuring the letter left the house without suspicion. Only one of you had both motive and temperament for that stratagem. His eyes slid shut for a moment, then opened, sharp as knives. "It was you, Mr. Lane." Daphne gasped. Edward cursed under his breath, and Philip half rose before sinking back. Lane's smirk faltered but returned almost at once. "An entertaining accusation. And your evidence?" "The evidence," Wolfe said, "is the method. Subtle, indirect, designed to humiliate by irony. Philip is blunt. Edward is careless. Daphne is vain, but not devious. Only you, Mr. Lane, would contrive to hide a weapon in flowers. Moreover, you alone vanished from observation during the precise window when the call was placed to the florist. Saul Panzer will attest." From the hall, Saul's voice carried in. "That's right. Lane slipped out to a payphone on Wednesday. 20 minutes gone. Came back whistling." Lane's composure cracked then, but Wolfe didn't let him recover. As for the second attempt, that was Philip. His quarrel with his brother made him desperate, and when he saw signs of the missing note, he fumbled for it. The scratches on the drawer are his mark. 2 thieves, 2 failures. The letter remains, but not for long, if I permit you to scurry further. The room erupted. Protests from Philip, denials from Lane. Camilla begging for quiet, but Wolfe merely raised a hand, and the noise subsided as if under spell. "I do not care for your squabbling," he said coldly. "The letter must be produced, here now, or I shall summon the police. Mr. Lane, you have it. I will give you one chance to surrender it with dignity. Fail, and you will be exposed publicly. Your choice." For a long moment, Lane sat still, face pale, smirk gone. Then, with a slow exhale, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a flat envelope. Silver, creased at the edges. He placed it on Wolfe's desk like a gambler folding his hand. Camilla let out a strangled breath. Philip muttered an oath. Edward buried his face in his hands. Daphne stared, eyes wide but unreadable. Wolfe didn't touch the envelope. "Archie," he said softly, "take it." I did, sliding it into my pocket. Lane leaned back, deflated but not beaten, his eyes already calculating some future alibi. Wolfe, however, was finished with him. "This," he said, "ends the disturbance. The letter will not see light beyond this room. Mrs. Hazen, you may reclaim it once I have sealed it from further folly. But remember, all of you, that secrets demand a price. Some of you have paid already, others will pay later. That is the way of rot." Silence followed, heavy and final. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and folded his hands across his stomach, as if the matter had cost him no more effort than pruning a stem. I ushered the Hazens and Lane out, one by one, their faces drawn, their words clipped. When the last door closed, the brownstone exhaled again. I turned to Wolfe. "So that's it? We just hand the letter back and call it a day?" His eyes opened, glinting. "It is not ours to wield, Archie. It is enough to have kept it from worse hands, and to remind them that even within families the most dangerous enemy is often seated at the table." He reached for his beer, and I knew the case was over. Dinner was waiting. Silence had returned, and the brownstone was once more inviolate, until the next silver spoon came knocking. I had half expected Wolfe to order Fritz to bring out champagne the moment the Hazens cleared the vestibule. But he didn't. He sat there in his chair, eyes closed, one hand resting lightly on the arm as if he were still weighing the air left behind by our visitors. The envelope in my pocket seemed to burn a hole through the fabric, not heavy but dense with the weight of lives it could twist. I leaned against the edge of the desk and waited, because I knew he wasn't finished. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. "Archie, remove the letter." I set it on the desk without ceremony. Wolfe didn't touch it. He studied it as if it were a specimen under glass. His lips pursed. You will not read it. Neither will I. Its contents are not the problem, but the principle. To expose it is to gratify some petty appetite. To conceal it is to allow rot. Therefore, we must return it with both dignity and warning. I raised an eyebrow. Warning how? You mean wagging a finger at them and telling them to behave? Phooey! I mean ensuring they understand the peril of trifling with such things. Mr. Lane is chastened for now, but not cured. Philip will bluster. Edward will drown himself in brandy. Daphne will toy with her illusions. Camilla, however, she will keep silence because silence is her fortress. We must make her the custodian once again, but with her eyes open to the futility of secrecy. I had heard Wolfe talk in circles before, but this was different. He was rolling the words slowly, carefully, as though each had its place in a design he wasn't ready to unveil. So tomorrow I trot back up there. And hand it over? I asked. He shook his head. No. She must come to us. Let her stand again in this office and take back the thing she brought. It is symbolic, Archie, and symbols are not to be wasted. That was final. Wolfe dismissed me with a wave, rang for beer, and by the time Fritz appeared, he was already leaning back with the smug contentment of a man who had pulled weeds from a garden. The next day, Camilla Hazen returned alone, her grey attire replaced with a darker navy, the set of her shoulders betraying fatigue. Wolfe barely looked at her as I placed the envelope on the desk. She reached for it, but his voice stopped her. Madam, one moment. You are a woman of resolve. Yet you came to me because your resolve was tested. That letter is a relic of failure. Guard it if you must, but know this. It will corrode everything it touches. Your husband is gone, the quarrel is done, yet the shadow remains. If you clutch it too tightly, it will destroy what you seek to protect. Camilla's fingers hovered above the envelope. For the first time since I'd met her, her composure cracked just faintly, like a porcelain surface catching a line of stress. She withdrew her hand, straightened, and said quietly, I understand. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. Not for thanks, Wolfe replied. For clarity. That is all I offer. She took the envelope then, tucked it into her bag, and left with no more words. I closed the door behind her and turned back to Wolfe. That's it? You give her a lecture on corrosion and let her walk out with it. What's to stop Lane from making another play, or Philip from trying again, or Edward from selling his cousin to the tabloids? Wolfe's eyes were closed again, but his voice was sharp. Because, Archie, the letter is no longer a secret. Not in the sense that matters. Each of them now knows it is known, knows that I know, and therefore that any further move will place them under scrutiny they cannot endure. Fear, not possession, will keep them silent. That is justice enough. I let that sink in. It wasn't the kind of tidy ending you read in detective magazines with handcuffs and confessions. But Wolfe never cared for tidy endings. He cared for equilibrium, for putting the pieces back in place so the world could go on turning without disturbing his orchids or his beer. That evening, dinner was roast duck with Fritz's wild rice, and Wolfe was in better spirits, even offering an unsolicited remark about the sauce. As I poured myself a glass of wine, I thought about the Hazens, Philip fuming, Edward drowning, Daphne scheming, Lane licking his wounds, and Camilla carrying the letter back to its drawer. Maybe they would live with it quietly. Maybe not. But the brownstone was silent again, and Wolfe was content, which meant, for the time being, so was I. He dabbed his lips with a napkin and leaned back. Archie, he said, there is no folly greater than believing the past can be caged in. Paper. People will always try. That is why they fail. I grinned. Maybe so, but it keeps us in business. He gave me a withering glance, reached for his beer, and closed the matter with a single sip. And just like that, the secret locked in a silver spoon was finished, at least for us. Outside the brownstone, the Hazens would carry their rot. Inside, dinner was served, orchids thrived, and life returned to its deliberate, immovable pace. The following morning should have been back to normal. The orchids upstairs demanding Wolfe's attention, Fritz humming in the kitchen, and me catching up on correspondence while keeping an eye on the phone. But normal never lasts when a case leaves too many raw edges. I'd barely settled at my desk when the phone rang, and the voice on the other end was one I recognized instantly, though it sounded thinner than before. It was Daphne Hazen. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. "I need to see you. Not Mr. Wolfe, just you. Please, it's important." Now, a request like that has "trap" stamped all over it, but her tone wasn't coy. It was urgent, almost frightened, and that gave me pause. I asked where, and she named a cafe downtown, far from the Hazen brownstone and any chance of being overheard by the family. I told her I'd be there in an hour. I mentioned it to Wolfe before leaving, expecting a standard bark about meddling. He surprised me. "Go, she will not confess, but she will reveal. Women in fear always reveal." The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where businessmen met for quick lunches. Daphne sat in a corner booth, sunglasses perched on her head though the light didn't call for them. She looked less composed than before, her hands clasped tight around a cup of coffee gone cold. "Mr. Goodwin," she said quickly as I slid into the seat, "you have to believe me. I didn't know. Not about the envelope, not about the letter being inside it. When I accepted those flowers, I thought they were from Marco. He sends things sometimes, though rarely so extravagant. If I'd known, I would have told you." Her eyes searched mine, desperate for something like reassurance. "I believe you didn't know at first," I said carefully. "But you must have realized later. You don't strike me as the type to stay in the dark once a light goes on." She bit her lip. "I suspected. After you mentioned the florist, I wondered. I even asked Marco, and he swore he hadn't sent them. That means someone wanted me to be the one to carry it. Someone used me." That much was obvious. But I let her spill. The more she spoke, the more likely she'd trip over the truth. She leaned closer. "You think it was Lane. I can see it in your eyes. But what if it wasn't? What if he was just the scapegoat? Then why did he have the letter in his pocket?" Her mouth tightened and she had no answer. I gave her a minute, then said, "Daphne, the truth is the letter doesn't matter anymore. Wolfe saw to that. It's back with your aunt. No one will use it now." Her laugh was short and bitter. "Do you really believe that? Philip will never let it rest. And Lane, he'll tell someone. He can't help himself. That letter is poison, and it's still out there." I left her sitting there with her coffee, her fear hanging in the air like smoke. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the report. He listened with his eyes closed, rocking his head slightly as if marking the rhythm of her words. "Puis," he said when I finished. "Of course it is not finished. The letter is a lever, and men such as Philip and Lane cannot resist pulling. But it no longer concerns us. I warned them, if they disregard, they will destroy themselves, not me." "Maybe so," I said. "But Daphne's scared enough to come running to me. If the family starts tearing itself apart, don't you think we'll get dragged back in?" He opened his eyes and fixed me with that flat stare. "Only if you allow them, Archie. Our work is done." I didn't argue, but I wasn't convinced. I'd seen too many families try to bury secrets only to dig themselves deeper. That letter hadn't finished its damage, not by a long shot. And I had the uneasy sense that before long, one of the Hazens would be at our door again, dragging the brownstone back into their web. That night, long after Wolfe had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I found myself replaying Daphne's words. "Someone used me." That line stuck because it sounded less like fear and more like realization. If Lane had been the clever one, he wouldn't have kept the letter in his pocket, ripe for discovery. He'd have hidden it better. Maybe he wanted to be caught, or maybe, just maybe, he was covering for someone else. The trouble was, Wolfe had closed the book, but I had the feeling the last page hadn't been written yet. I wasn't wrong. The Hazens might have left our office that night with pale faces and stiff backs, but I knew too much about human nature to think Wolfe's warning would keep them quiet forever. And sure enough, 2 days later, just after Fritz had set down a plate of braised veal that had Wolfe humming like a baritone, the phone rang. Fritz answered, murmured something polite, and then poked his head into the dining room with the reluctance of a man delivering a telegram from the undertaker. "It is Mrs. Hazen," he said. Wolfe scowled at the interruption, but motioned for me to take it. I stepped into the office and lifted the receiver. Camilla Hazen's voice came through sharp and brittle. "Mr. Goodwin, I must speak with you and Mr. Wolfe immediately. Something has happened. It's Philip. He's been found unconscious in his study. The police are there. They think—" Her breath hitched. "They think he tried to take his own life." I didn't answer right away. There was something in her tone that didn't match the words. Not grief, not even shock, but a kind of controlled panic, as though she was less concerned about her brother-in-law's health than about the ripple it would cause. I told her we'd be in touch and hung up. Wolfe was waiting, arms folded, expression like granite. "Well," I relayed it, and he grunted. "Nonsense. Philip Hazen is too fond of bluster to attempt self-destruction. More likely he overindulged in whiskey and melodrama. Still," he shifted his weight slightly, "a major concession. Archie, you will go. See what lies beneath." So I did. By the time I reached the Hazen residence, the place was buzzing with uniforms. A police doctor was just coming down the stairs, muttering to a detective. I recognized Inspector Kramer's bulk before I heard his bark. He spotted me in the hall and came over with the expression of a man who'd found a cockroach in his soup. "Goodwin, what the devil are you doing here?" "House call," I said. "Mrs. Hazen rang us up. Thought you'd enjoy the company." He growled something unprintable and jabbed a finger toward the study. "Philip Hazen. Found on the floor, empty bottle beside him. Looks like sleeping pills, though the doc says the dosage doesn't add up to suicide. He'll live, but he's in no shape to answer questions." I looked around the room. The desk drawer, was ajar again. I crouched to see the lock. This time there was no finesse, no scratches, just open. Whoever had been fumbling before wasn't fumbling now. They had keys or knowledge. And the spoon that had started all this, the one Camilla first showed us, was gone. Kramer saw where I was looking. "Yeah, they tell me some trinkets missing. Silverware. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Not a thing," I said smoothly. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't eat with spoons unless Fritz polishes them first." That didn't amuse him. He told me to clear out before he hauled me in just on principle. So I took the hint. On my way out, Daphne caught my arm in the vestibule. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed. "It wasn't suicide. Don't let them say it was. He was frightened, not broken." "Frightened of what?" She glanced over her shoulder, lowered her voice. "Of Aunt Camilla, of what she planned to do with the letter." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean, planned to do?" But before she could answer, Riggs appeared behind her like a shadow, and she clamped her mouth shut. I left without pressing, but the words rang in my ears all the way back to the brownstone. When I laid it out for Wolfe, the police, the pills, the missing spoon, Daphne's whisper, he pressed his lips together until they nearly disappeared. Pui. So the game persists. Philip was meddling, and someone silenced him with a theatrical gesture. And the spoon— He opened his eyes wide for a moment, then closed them again. "Archie, we have been deceived. The spoon was never incidental. It is the key." I frowned. "A spoon, not the letter." "Yes, the letter is leverage, but the spoon is location. A family heirloom, engraved, catalogued. One removed, one returned. That spoon concealed something or pointed to it. That is why it was disturbed first. Not as a trinket, Archie, but as a cipher. He shifted in his chair, visibly irritated with himself. I should have seen it sooner. Bah! I sat back, whistling low. So, what's our next move? Wolfe opened his eyes, and the glint in them told me the lull was over. Tomorrow evening, Archie. They will come again, all of them, and this time I will wring from them not just possession, Tsar, but purpose. Whoever struck at Philip, whoever steals spoons and toys with notes, will find the brownstone less forgiving than their own house. The way he said it left no doubt. The Hazens had stirred the brownstone twice. This time, it was going to strike back. The Hazens filed into the office once more, drawn together like pieces of a puzzle they would rather scatter. Wolfe sat where he always did, squarely behind his desk, the bulk of him immovable, his eyes half-lidded. I stood to the side with my notebook, though I didn't need to write much. The words about to be spoken weren't going anywhere. Camilla was first, erect and composed, though her hands betrayed tension. Philip followed, pale and weak from his recent accident, with Riggs hovering like a watchman. Edward slouched, eyes bloodshot, the smell of liquor clinging to him, while Daphne entered with a stiffness that made her seem older than her years. Victor Lane came last, face guarded, smirk gone. Wolfe let them arrange themselves in silence before speaking. "We are here," he began, "because you are not content to let matters lie. You prod, you pry, and you wound one another like children fighting over scraps. Very well. Tonight we shall end it." He turned his gaze on Philip. "Your collapse was no suicide attempt. It was staged, or rather, it was induced. Someone dosed you with enough to fell a bull, though not to kill. You were meant to be silenced, Philip. That much is obvious." Philip's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "The question is," Wolfe continued, "who silenced you and why? The answer is in the spoon." "Archie." I stepped forward and placed the silver spoon on Wolfe's desk. He tapped it once with a finger as though to punctuate the point. This spoon was more than silver. It was a cipher. Within its stem, concealed beneath the crest, was a compartment, small but sufficient to hold a slip of paper. The first theft removed not just the letter, but the knowledge of where it had been hidden. The spoon was the key, the letter the lock. Together they formed leverage. Separated, they were bait. I glanced at the suspects. Lane shifted in his chair. Edward flushed, Daphne swallowed hard, and Camilla's gaze didn't flicker. "Mr. Lane," Wolfe said, his tone like iron under velvet. "You were the courier. You arranged the florist's delivery and carried off the letter in its envelope. But you did not understand the spoon. You thought the letter was all." Lane opened his mouth, but Wolfe raised a hand. "Be silent. Your cleverness betrayed you the moment Saul Panzer saw you at the payphone. You are not the mind behind this." He shifted his attention. "Philip, your clumsy attempt at the drawer proved you were searching for what you had lost. Not the letter. You knew Lane had it, but the spoon. You guessed its importance too late. Your desperation left marks even a dullard could see. Still, you are not the mind behind this either." Philip muttered an oath under his breath, but no one acknowledged it. "Edward," Wolfe said, "you drink, you gamble, you squander. You could have sold the letter for reprieve, but you lack the imagination to orchestrate such deception. You are a parasite, not a schemer." Edward turned crimson but offered no defense. Wolfe's eyes moved at last to Daphne. "You, my dear, were the unwitting pawn, used to ferry the note, flattered into believing it a token of admiration. You are guilty only of vanity. But your fear, your sudden rush to Mr. Goodwin, betrayed knowledge. You realized you had been used, and you feared it would be known. Still, you are not the mind behind this." The room was taut with silence. Wolfe let it hang before finally turning to Camilla. "Madam, you are the mind. You alone knew both the letter and the spoon's secret. You summoned us with the spoon because you wished to test whether your family would scramble for it, whether they would expose themselves, and they did. Philip quarrelled, Edward blustered, Daphne carried, Lane stole. You let them because you wished to see who among them would prove most dangerous. When Philip pressed too far, you silenced him. When Lane pocketed the letter, you allowed it, knowing that in his hands it was useless without the spoon. You hold the true power still. Camilla's eyes met Wolfe's without flinching, though the silence around her was thick enough to choke. At last she said softly, "And if I did? If I wished to protect my family from itself, to expose the weakest, to keep the shame buried? What then, Mr. Wolfe?" "Then you have succeeded," Wolfe said. "But you have also revealed what you are willing to do. You asked me to recover a letter. Instead, I have uncovered a truth. That the letter was never the danger. You were. You always were." Camilla straightened, lips pressed thin, but she said no more. Wolfe leaned back. "The letter will remain sealed. The spoon will be returned. Your family, such as it is, may choose to rot in silence, but let me be clear, if another hand is raised, if another feeble attempt at melodrama disturbs my house, I will see it dragged into light with names and dates. You will not like the glare." He closed his eyes, dismissing them as surely as if he had rung a bell. One by one they filed out, chastened or defiant, each carrying the weight of Wolfe's words. Only Camilla paused at the door, glancing back once, her face unreadable. Then she was gone. The brownstone was quiet again. Wolfe reached for his beer, and I leaned against the desk, shaking my head. "You know, one of these days you'll get tired of exposing rot in the rich and respectable." He took a long swallow, then set the glass down. "Archie, human folly is inexhaustible. It renews itself daily. Were it not so, I should starve, intellectually if not literally." I grinned. Good thing, then, that people keep secrets worse than their silverware. He shot me a look, closed his eyes, and let the silence return, leaving me to wonder whether the Hazens would heed his warning, or whether the rot he spoke of would keep eating, long after the brownstone had washed its hands of them, 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 its hands of them.